Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Tori Murden McClure. She is an explorer, author, and president of Spalding University. But I want to say that Tori is perhaps best known as the first woman and first American to row a boat solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Welcome, Tori.
Thanks for having me.
Well, as I was reading your bio, I was so intrigued because of your diverse career that you've worked as a chaplain at a hospital, that you've been a director of a women's shelter, a policy assistant in the Louisville mayor's office, and the first full-time employee of Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville. That is like really diverse. And so I thought, wow, well, first I want to know, where did you grow up?
So I was born in Florida, but it was not my fault. My parents, that's where my parents were at the time. But I grew up in sort of Connecticut, Pennsylvania, east side of Pennsylvania, west side of Pennsylvania, and moved to Kentucky to take care of a grandmother who had Alzheimer's, and went to high school in Kentucky. And when folks in Kentucky, sad but true, ask you where you went to school, they are not asking where you went to college. They want to know what high school you went to, because that puts you in a particular socioeconomic box. And I came here to go to high school, so it counts, almost like I'm a native.
Almost like you're a native. That is really interesting that it's not where you went to college, because I think most everywhere, but I get that, especially living in Wyoming. And it's kind of like Wyomingites all know exactly where people are from just by the number on their license plate.
Right. Yeah.
It means something if you have a low number on your license plate. And if you're a newcomer, then you have a much higher number, right?
Right. Your cachet gets lower.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you went to high school in Kentucky.
Yes. And then went on to Massachusetts, Smith College for my undergrad, and then worked for a year, and then went to Divinity School at Harvard, and then worked for a while and ran a homeless shelter for homeless women. And now we call them people without homes, but in those days we called them homeless people. And as I was doing that, I was realizing all the sort of economic and other issues that were putting these women on the street. And so I went to law school to learn the language of the enemy. And it was really about trying to change the policies that were causing folks to be so economically challenged that they lost housing. And so that's what sent me to law school.
I was a single mom at one time, and that's what I wanted to do, was go to law school. But at the time, it was just such a huge burden. But it was for the same issue. It's like, how do I protect women? What happens to women? And when they get divorced, what happens to them? And there's just so many issues that are just in the background that people, and there's social issues, but they're also just things that happen because you're a woman. It's kind of the way it's set up for women. And that was one of the things I wanted to ask you, because of all the careers and things that you've done, but you're also very competitive. You're a competitor, and you've been an athlete. What inspired your athleticism?
That's a multi-pronged question, in the sense that I grew up with a brother who's intellectually disabled, and a lot of my backcountry desires for expeditions and experiences really grew out of the fact that I was never able to really protect my brother from the neighborhood bullies, whomever they may have been. But as I progressed through school, and we moved quite a lot as I was growing up, we moved 13 times as I was growing up. And so I learned very quickly that you couldn't really gain friends by being the smartest kid in the room, but you could gain friends by being athletically competitive or successful. And so that became an outlet for me. I have a much stronger intellectual drive than I do an athletic drive, but it was a way to make friends and fit in. And then as I grew older, and of course, choosing to go to an all-women's college like Smith, you really get steeped in the history of education for women and the history of justice and injustice. And I don't know that, divorce is a bad economic move for men as well. There's not a winning proposition on either side, but unhappiness and dysfunction need to come to an end. And so there are no winners in that scene. But one of the issues that I was the first generation to benefit from Title IX, and Title IX really getting some teeth. Now, many of us have a huge misconception when it comes to Title IX in athletics. As it was originally conceived, Title IX had nothing to do with women's athletics and women being excluded from the playing field. It was really women being excluded from graduate programs. You could not be a college professor unless you had a master's or a doctorate, and more likely a doctorate. And women just weren't being admitted to doctoral programs and terminal degree programs. And it was Bernie Sanders and some other folks who really just started to lobby and cause a ruckus and sue people to try to be admitted into these upper level graduate programs at prestigious schools and less prestigious schools. And the fact that I'm a university president is far more related to Title IX than the fact that I was a college athlete. And certainly I was a college athlete at Smith. There was never any problem with women being allowed to have access to the playing field at Smith College. But today we are seeing probably the biggest downturn, I guess, for women's equity in athletics, and that is with the name, image, and likeness changes. Now, I was on the board of governors of the NCAA when NIL was voted through, and I recognized that this was going to be bad for women, but so many state legislatures were lobbying and changing laws and making it a requirement that young people could benefit from their names, their images, or their likenesses in the sort of economic venue. And there's no question that there are a few women benefiting from NIL, but mostly it's young men benefiting from name, image, and likeness being turned into a commodity. And I don't know how this is going to shake out. I think college athletics, as we knew it just a couple of years ago, is at an end. We've always had kind of semi-pro or semi-professional athletic teams attached to academic institutions, but now the veil of amateurism is quickly being pulled back, and now we have professional athletic programs attached to academic institutions at the Division I level, and possibly even a little bit at the Division II level. Institutions like the one I serve, Spalding University in Louisville, Kentucky, we're a Division III school, as is Smith College, and lots of the private liberal arts institutions all tend to be Division III, which means we don't offer athletic scholarships. And so it would be rare, not unheard of, but rare for one of our student athletes to benefit from selling their name, image, or likeness. It would probably be unrelated to their athleticism at our institution. So the equity at Division III schools is probably still pretty strong, but Division I, it's going to be ugly for a while.
Well, that's really sad, isn't it? I was listening to how interesting it is that you became an athlete as a way to not being a nerd. A nerd was, or being a brainiac or whatever you want to call it, but the academic love that you have. But throughout your life, you've really gravitated, and I don't know if you're just a natural athlete, as some people are, or that was just part of your inner being, that you found athletics to be an outlet of expression, and you excelled at it, obviously. But why rowing?
I learned to row at Smith College, and I am a world-class introvert, right? So the two sports that I really gravitated toward were cross-country skiing and rowing in a single scull, both of which are activities that it's really hard to have somebody be right beside you as you're doing those activities. And so they're great activities for someone who's naturally pretty introverted. How I became a university president is the big question, because it is a horrible role for somebody who's very introverted to have to spend all day and every day with people, usually raising money. I feel like I eat for a living sometimes. But we all, I've been super fortunate in walking through the doors of opportunity as they open.
Well, you have done that. And I think it's interesting. My son-in-law went to the Duke Divinity School.
Uh-huh.
And so you have such a diverse, even in your degrees that you hold, they're all very much focused on your love of social issues, it looks like.
I do think, I like to think of myself as the champion of the underdog in whatever form that might be. And for example, I lead an institution that hardly anyone's ever heard of, Spalding University. And we serve a student body that would be considered scrappy. When I'm feeling self-depreciative, I would say Spalding is on the shallow end of the higher education gene pool. But our students, we're not battling with Smith or Amherst as to, how to get students from them. We're battling with McDonald's and Walmart and making sure young people have an opportunity to access a really high quality education at an affordable price.
Oh my gosh, I love hearing that. I want to know a bit about, because it's just struck me as something very interesting to work for Muhammad Ali. And did you meet him? And how did you become his first full-time employee?
When I worked for the mayor of Louisville, Jerry Abramson, who now the mayor works at Spalding, which makes me very happy. I worked for him and now he works for me. Perfect. There were lots of different folks trying to create kind of a museum to honor Muhammad Ali in Louisville, his hometown. And Muhammad had many gifts, but being able to tell the good white people from the bad white people was not among them. And so there were lots of these nefarious characters that would be wandering through trying to do stuff with Muhammad Ali. And finally, the mayor of Louisville just had enough of these clowns and said, Muhammad, if we need to do something to honor your legacy, and please let me put together some quality people to help you do it. And by quality, I mean intellectuals, folks who weren't just doing it to stand beside Muhammad and try to make some money. And so I worked for the mayor at that point, and Muhammad came into the mayor's office and all the important people met him. And I was, what I thought of as the bounding puppy. I was a little more than an intern, but not much. I was being paid, but not very much. And I held back and sort of stood in the corner of the room. And after Muhammad had shaken hands with everybody else, he looked at me like, kid, are you not going to come over and shake my hand? And so I very sort of bashfully walked up and shook his hand and then kind of ran back to my corner. But he was so gracious with the folks who were socially awkward, or gracious with folks he recognized as folks who'd been through some stuff and were maybe a little broken. He had definitely had a soft spot for those folks. And I tried to row a boat alone across the Atlantic Ocean, was unsuccessful in my first attempt because I got hit by a hurricane and came home very beaten and very broken. And the mayor had to leave office because of a term limit. And I was asked if I wanted to take a job working for Muhammad Ali. And I was like, well, yes, I would. And Muhammad knew where I was as a human being better than I did. Muhammad Ali got to be the world champion 3 times. Guess what? You don't get to do it 3 times if you don't lose twice pretty epically along the way. And so he knew where I was. I had been knocked down and I was struggling to get back up. And he sort of shepherded me through that process. And every time he visited Louisville, he would kind of come by, and he never, physically popped me in the arm or punched me, but it was that sense of, kid, you got to get up. Kid, you got to get up. And when he knew I was ready, which was, months and months after I'd been working for him, he said to me, Tori, you don't want to go through life as the woman who almost rowed across the ocean. And he was right. So I went back and was successful in completing the row across the ocean. But Muhammad had a big piece of that.
That is so exciting that, one, yeah, you're right. You don't get to be a champion without falling down a few times. And getting yourself back up and doing it all over again. And you hear about those stories about how people just overcome defeat to get to the next place. And you had that kind of mentorship with him. And I think that is so amazing. And gosh, that must be that just must make your heart soar when you think about that.
Yeah, he was a pretty magical character, and flawed and complicated, as all the most interesting people are.
So I didn't realize until you just told your story that way. You were going to sail your boat. You ran into what was the name of the storm you ran into?
Hurricane Danielle. Like many people, I learn more from my failures than I do from my successes. And failure is a very good teacher. You're very attentive to what it has to teach.
The first time, and you ran into Hurricane Danielle, which I think is still on record for being one of the hurricanes in history, right?
No, actually, Hurricane Danielle, well, it had a long life. And what in the United States would be referred to as a fish storm, because it kind of missed the east coast of the United States, didn't do too much damage. But when it hit Scotland and England, it was still a pretty violent storm. And so it hit me 1,000 miles out to sea before it hit them. So it was a rough storm, but not a particularly epic in terms of the record books.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Epic in terms of a woman alone in a rowboat, certainly plenty epic. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure. And so how long were you out in the rowboat at that time on the ocean by yourself?
I'd been out for 78 days and I lost communications 8 days from the start. So for 70 days, had no contact with anyone on land. And so no one could say, hey, look out, there's a hurricane coming. I could just see, the ocean. I wrote in my journal, the ocean is wrong. You just had the sense that the rhythm was off, that things were amiss. And I kept getting hit by what we call rogue waves that were way bigger than the conditions would account for. And they were sort of the outriders to the hurricane that kept smacking me. And then the big storm came.
So I just want to back up for just a minute, because now that I'm really into your story and your life story and the history of your life, is just understanding what was the inspiration or the idea that you wanted to be this person, the first woman to row across the Atlantic Ocean.
There wasn't that big a standalone. So when I was in Divinity School at Harvard, I took off 2.5 months in the middle of my last year to ski to the geographical South Pole. Now, I wasn't alone on that trip. There were 6 Americans and 2 women who became the first women and first Americans to reach the South Pole by an overland route. And so there'd been sort of big adventures before that. So it just seemed like a reasonable step beyond other reasonable steps. And at some point you pass the boundaries of reason, but when you're just going one step at a time, it doesn't seem that dramatic. And again, it ties back to growing up with my brother Lamar and always feeling like, man, if I can just climb this mountain, I won't feel helpless anymore. If I can ski across this continent, I won't feel helpless anymore. And helpless meaning I could help the people who needed my protection. I could stop injustices from happening when they were happening right in front of me. That somehow I would become bigger or smarter or stronger or faster. And I'd be able to have this magic wand that would help me to solve problems in what we laughingly call the civilized world. And there's something quite healing about being out in nature, away from the competing agendas. And certainly folks in Wyoming get this inherently, because you've chosen a life that's closer to the bone, chosen a life that's closer to the wilderness and the backcountry. And, you feel the weather, you don't just change the thermostat. And so that sense of grounding that one gets from a close connection with nature was something I kept trying to bring back into civilization, as if it was a form of enlightenment that I would be able to hold on to. Eventually I realized, I can row to the moon. I'm still going to just be a human being. And there's something about being human. And it's those elements of helplessness. And in the end, the first line of my book, A Pearl in the Storm, is, in the end, I know I rowed across the Atlantic to find my heart. But in the beginning, I wasn't aware that it was missing. I was such an intellectual being, I thought I could find enlightenment in books. I could find enlightenment in study. I could find enlightenment somewhere between my ears. And the row across the ocean, the real story is I fell in love between my first attempt to row across the ocean and my second successful attempt to row across the ocean. And shortly after I got out of that successful rowboat journey, I literally stepped out of the rowboat into the arms of a guy named Mac McClure, and I married him just a few weeks later. And I feel like I've been in his arms ever since. Most women do not need to row 3,333 miles to figure out that love and friendship are good things. Most women just get it. Me, I was a slow learner in that respect. And none of us can master all of humanity at any kind of progressed level. We're good at some things and we're not so good at others.
Well, and I like what you said, that you are an extreme introvert. You prefer those alone spaces, and your job is the exact opposite of that.
Right.
Which is why God has such a good sense of humor.
Yes.
and so I think it's interesting that you did choose things that put you alone by yourself. And, whenever I meet people that really do like that alone space, they really do still have that yearning, because people do need other people. People want to be loved and accepted. And a lot of times it's their insecurity of that they push away and go hide in the corner or just be by themselves.
Yeah, or their sense of brokenness or inadequacy. I don't have any lack of self-esteem or self-worth, but the sense of, I have not always succeeded in taking care or protecting the people who have needed my protection. And that is a sense of failure that is hard to overcome. And I can look back and go, well, okay, the first time I had that sense of failure, I was a toddler. Was I really supposed to hold myself accountable for something that happened when I was in diapers? Perhaps not, but that sense of failure is real.
Well, that's super interesting in and of itself. I have a daughter, she and her husband, Federico, who went to Duke Divinity School. They have two children adopted from China, one from Beijing, one Hong Kong, and they're both physically challenged. Zixin is also, she has hydrocephalus.
Mm-hmm.
It is really interesting how those challenges do make you so much aware of a child's vulnerability and what they're going to face in the world. And I always tell Veronica, my daughter, I'm like, it scares me, because she's beautiful. She's a beautiful little Chinese girl growing up. And I just don't want to see her being taken advantage of or being made fun of, or, all those cruel things that can happen to children.
Yeah. And I don't know that there's anyone who really escapes it entirely. We've come through a period, particularly with COVID, where, it's like we wanted to categorize people as most oppressed or less oppressed. And that's not helpful. All of us have our run-ins with catastrophe. All of us have our run-ins with unfairness. Now, absolutely, it is true that those who have fewer economic resources, those who come from historically oppressed minorities, yeah, it's worse for them. No doubt about it. Racism is real. Racism is wrong. And we need to be allies and advocates to stop it, particularly when it's right with us. But the notion that anyone escapes harm and suffering is ill-advised to take that point of view, because you need the most privileged among us to feel pain, to feel the catastrophe of what is wrong in civilization, so that they will act and take action to change it, to shift it. And if we are so busy saying, you are privileged, you are unharmed, you are, you've had it all, you can't even speak, that's doing an injustice for those who are in a better position to make change. So I think we all need to feel our vulnerabilities. We all need to feel the pain and suffering of the world, and particularly the pain and suffering of of those who have had fewer advantages.
Yes, that's true. And I guess on some things you said, I agree. And some of it, I feel like growing up in a big Hispanic family and understanding discrimination, and my dad was head of the migrant program for over 33 years in Fort Collins. And it's hard to walk in another person's shoes, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't think we can, but we can.
I think you can have empathy, but
right, or just a consciousness that
yes, a consciousness.
Yeah.
Well, Tori, tell me about your book, because that was the one thing I wanted to learn about. What I know, the whole trip and the fact that you made it across inspired your book, but what is the core message, and what do you want people to take away and learn from in your journey?
The book is called A Pearl in the Storm. That title came from an editor. Authors don't really get to pick their titles. And the book had a terrible title for a very long time. The publishing house initially called it I Had to Row Across an Ocean, which was a horrible title. The boat was named The American Pearl, and the book is titled A Pearl in the Storm. Most of the book is about my failed attempt to row across the ocean. The bulk of the book is my failed attempt to row across the ocean. And then there's a sort of interlude of working for Muhammad Ali and then my successful journey. The story goes back and forth, touches on my childhood. There were things at that time that I really had not come to terms with my parents and my family. And there were stories at that point that I felt were not mine to tell. And so there's a lot left out of the book that I've come to terms with since. And what caused me to come to terms with those missing elements are two amazing humans, Dawn Landis and Danny Goldstein, turned my book into a musical called Row. And they sort of needed more of the backstory and the pieces that I'd left out. And they did a remarkable piece of work. It was supposed to premiere in the summer of 2020. Of course, that got canceled because of COVID. But they kept the cast together and recorded the musical for Audible. And I think it was the first musical to premiere on the Audible format. So for a whopping $5.50 or something, you too can listen to Row on Audible. And I have zero economic interest. So none of that comes to me. So I'm pretty proud of that, because Dawn and Danny did all the work to create this really pretty remarkable musical. Now, because it was conceived during COVID, this particular iteration of the musical goes to some fairly dark and stormy places. It ends up in a happy spot. But I think given another opportunity, Dawn and Danny would lean more to the light. But it was appropriate for COVID for it to sort of be a little dark and stormy.
Well, I think that does. I mean, it's interesting that it happened during COVID, but and it's interesting that it's mostly about your failed attempt and the lessons you learned. And I'm sure, I can't even imagine, being on a boat in the ocean by myself for, what was it, 88 days? Yeah,
it was 81 on my successful trip and 85 on my unsuccessful trip.
Okay. In a 23-foot plywood boat with no motor or sail. When I read that, I was like, can't even imagine it. So It must have been amazing to someone's imagination, especially the two gentlemen that you said produced it, that it does have this dark side to it.
And so it's Dawn, who's a woman, and Danny, who is
okay.
Somebody asked, what's it like having a musical about, your life? And I said, well, it's a little like getting stripped naked in public. It was produced for the stage at the Williamstown Theater Festival in the summer of 21. Still very much COVID. The actors weren't allowed to sort of interact. They had to all be in their separate spaces. They had to do it outside, which was fraught because it was horrible weather summer. Lots of mayhem ensued with bad weather. But the actor who played me both in the Audible production and the stage production is this amazing actor named Grace McLean. And Grace is in her mid-30s and is just spectacular. But somebody said, well, it's a little like getting stripped naked in public, but it turns out I'm in my mid-30s. I'm a redhead. I have fantastic talent and an amazing body. So what do I have to complain about?
I like that.
Yeah. So part of the book that I'm proud of is it's a story about a woman alone in a rowboat. And yet this woman is going through things that are true for most humans, that the musical picked up on these universal themes of love and loss and yearning. And it ends up in this really happy place. So I am not at all embarrassed that someone managed to actually write a musical about a woman alone in a rowboat and that it's pretty good. Yeah.
I can't wait to hear it and watch it. It sounds so interesting. And the music must be really dynamic because you're going through these extreme kinds of situations.
Right.
And you built your boat yourself. You told me that.
I did. To be more accurate, I put it together. I didn't design the boat. It was designed by a British fellow, Philip Morrison, who did the designs. And so I followed those designs and built the boat.
Still, that is amazing, even in and of itself. Speaking from someone has a son who's been to the wooden boat building school in Port Townsend, Washington. So I get that. And
I have since built a number of cedar ship canoes and other boats that probably were more complicated to put together than the American Pearl was.
You like to work with your hands.
I do like to work with my hands.
And don't you think working with your hands, because I feel that when, especially someone who has a job like yours, it's pretty intense. You're in the computer all the time, or, like you said, you have to raise fundraising.
Yeah. And so, most of my hobbies are physical in some way, whether it's rowing or cross-country skiing, which I do on wheels in Kentucky, because we don't have enough snow usually for me to ski outside. So I ski outside on wheels. But, I woodwork. I make leather briefcases and make things out of leather, very tactile kind of things. And as your hands are busy putting things together or perfecting things, your mind is free to solve whatever problem it's working on in the workaday world.
I know it's Zen, I think. And can I order a briefcase from you?
Yeah, I am very slow. Well, I just broke my wrist over the holidays, so I heard about that. I'm laid up a little bit. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, it has been so great talking to you, Tori. It's been so fun. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.